backyard, and he showed me Saturn, when I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and that did it. I know it did it for a lot of other people. And I spent most of my working career in the business of making computer graphics equipment for television broadcasting. I worked for a company here on the island for many years. And I was always kind of an electronics hobbyist. I'm a gearhead. I know a lot of us are gearheads, but in terms of deep knowledge of astronomy, I haven't really done anything since college and until these meetings. And I was telescopeless for a while. I had in the kind of early 90s, I had a little Meade ETX 90 and enjoyed it. It was a go-to. I didn't have to figure out where stuff was, and it got stolen. And so cut to 2018, and I was retired. The kids were out of the house. My wife said, he must be sad without a telescope. So she brought me a birthday present, and I got a 6-inch Celestron. And that turned out to be a kind of fortuitous choice for me. Now, of course, I live here on the island. We can't see anything. I was strictly a visual astronomer, other than some brief experiments in college with a badly focused SLR on a telescope. I have a picture from that if anyone really cares. But so I did visual for a while with the C6, and frankly, I I ran out of things that were compelling to see, and so we then cut further to April 2023, which was my birthday, and my wife and I had gone to an open house event out in Stony Brook, and they were doing EAA in the park, and I said, "Wow, look, I can see all this stuff. I'm not looking at faint, fuzzy blobs." And so my wife tucked that away, and in April she bought me a camera, and she actually got good advice on the camera. I have had a real mixture of good and bad advice about planetary imaging, and a lot of bad advice, which I'll try to rectify a little here. But Frank over at Camera Concept said, "Well, that's a planetary telescope. So the only kind of imaging he's going to be able to do is planetary imaging. So buy him a planetary camera. And if he graduates to real stuff later on, he can use it as a guide camera." And that turned out to be very good advice. So there are a lot of things that made sense to me in planetary. First of all, it was not a big financial investment once I had the telescope. You know, I've since gone much further down the rabbit hole, and I do now have all kinds of deep sky stuff and everything else. But this was a really great way to get started, and I really suggest it, if for those of you who don't do it, that the barrier to entry is very low. The hard thing is finding good advice, but doing it itself is in many ways much simpler than a lot of other kinds of imaging. Also, critically, you don't need dark skies. This, if you're looking at that picture, that's my standard workhorse observing location. That's my C8 setup out there. You'll see I have a street lamp right over it. That's fine. In fact, daytime, if you can see them, is fine. Planets are really not, planetary astrophotography is not dependent on dark skies. And here's another example. This is my current rig. This is a Celestron 9¼ that I borrowed from Carl Silverberg in the club. He hadn't been using it for a while. And here I've got it set up in the same driveway. This is a couple of weeks ago, so you can see the snow. And the red glints on it are from 2 ambulances flashing their lights about 200 feet down the road from me, and I could hardly see the computer screen. However, the captures worked out great. So a lot of things are appealing about planetary. Planetary cameras are very inexpensive compared to cameras that people use for deep sky astrophotography. They don't have to be cooled. They don't have to have large sensors. Large sensors are wasted. You don't need expensive fast focal ratio telescopes. And in fact, they're going to work against you. You need long focal lengths. And I'll talk about it in a minute. You have to properly adjust your focal length to the size of the pixels in your camera in order to get, in order to be properly sampled. Now, I had some good advice, and some other folks at local stores didn't give me such good advice. I heard from everybody, oh boy, you should get an ASI Air and it'll run all the stuff and it'll plate solve and you don't have to do anything. And I stuck with it for several months, and then I learned to my chagrin that it really was not a device for planetary capture. I don't see any way around planetary capture with either a PC or a Mac or a Linux, in some cases, laptop. This is a closer up look at that 8-inch rig that's been my capture workhorse for the last while, and you can see here this is a mini computer. I know a lot of you guys have them mounted on the side of the scope. This one's inexpensive. I don't use it all the time. I use my laptop a fair bit of the time, but it doesn't have to be exotic. You do need a lot of storage. As we get into it later, when I'm shooting planets, I'm shooting at 100 to 200 or sometimes 250 frames a second of uncompressed images. Now, they happen to be fairly small images because you don't capture a lot of black space typically around the planets, but still they really add up in storage. And I've had nights, I had a night of observing all night where I used almost 3/4 of a terabyte of storage just in one night. And typically what I do is if I have a fast solid state drive in this little mini computer, or for my laptop, I use an external solid state drive. This happens to be a 4 TB one, which seemed like a lot a long time ago. And they're cheap now, and that's not really a barrier to entry. And an important thing is the software isn't a barrier to entry either. All of the software I use is free for both acquisition and processing, with the one exception of and I'll show it in detail later, SharpCap Pro, which is a whole, I don't know, $18 a year or something like that for a subscription. So it's none of this. I'll go into a little more detail about the software later, but that's not a barrier to entry either. Now, the one piece of specialized equipment that I use quite a bit, and most serious planetary imagers do, whether I'm one of them or not, is an atmospheric dispersion corrector. If you back up a little bit, you can see it sitting at the back of my telescope here where the cursor is wiggling around. It's not common in astrophotography except for planetary astrophotography. Planets are big and bright, and often we want to capture them when they're not very high up in the sky because they're doing interesting things. And most of you folks know that different wavelengths of light get diffracted differently through atmosphere. And the more atmosphere you're shooting through, the more that happens. So typically when you're looking at a bright planet on a camera, you're going to see a blue fringe on one side and a red fringe on the other side, and the green is in the middle, not discernible. And atmospheric dispersion correctors let you tune that out. They have two counter-rotating prisms. You see there are little levers on the side here, and you can independently adjust them so that the red, green, and blue converge. And it makes a big difference in imaging. I started without one, but my images got much better when I went to one. And they're about 120 bucks. There are really fancy ones that are automatic that observatories use. Some of them are several $1,000s. There's a Chinese one now for a few $100s that's supposed to be automatic. One thing about an atmospheric dispersion corrector is you constantly have to adjust it as the planet gets higher, which makes remote imaging much more challenging. And I don't do any remote planetary imaging. I'm always at the side of the scope. I know Frank Melillo's set up so he can do some stuff remotely. I haven't gotten there yet. So here's another, this is perhaps one of the biggest pieces of misinformation out there. Everybody who has heard of planetary imaging says, oh, you probably need a Barlow lens, you need a long focal length. But you're not just picking this stuff randomly. There are rules. What we're trying to do is we're trying to critically sample an image. And think of it this way: if I'm taking a picture of your face and I put 9 pixels across your face and look at it from a distance, I can probably tell it's a face, but I can't tell if it's yours or not. On the other hand, if I put 46 megapixels on your face, I'm wasting an awful lot of efficiency and light gathering and noise. So somewhere there's a critical sampling ratio where which is based on the diffraction limited resolution of your telescope, the aperture of your telescope, and the size of the pixels in your camera. And it's a very, very simple formula. I have the math up here if anyone wants it, and I have some links later on to much more formal derivations of the mathematics. But basically, you want to put several pixels across whatever is going to be the smallest thing you want to resolve, or you're able to resolve. And so there is a critical sampling ratio that's formally divided. And it turns out, it comes out to 5 times, you want a focal ratio that's 5 times the size of your pixels in microns. It's an incredibly simple formula. So I use a camera that's a 2.9 micron pixels. So this says I want to capture it f14. Now, what you don't want to do is be below that. So below that is undersampling. And by the way, the online telescope calculators don't really account for this. They're not set up for planetary. They do discuss undersampling and oversampling, but not much about what it means. You really want to sample critical sampling, so you don't want to go too far over because you don't want to waste photons. So, you want those photons to come in a lot. But you don't want to undersample because then you're not going to recover details. Your imaging is going to be jagged. It's a bad experience. A little bit of oversampling is much better than a little bit of undersampling. So 5 times pixel size in micron. A lot of us have Schmidt-Cassegrain telescopes. They tend to be f10. I happen to use 1.5 Barlow to get it up to the right ratio, because there are a lot of planetary imaging cameras now that have 2 micron pixels or even 1.45 micron pixels. And 2 micron pixels, I actually recently bought one of them because that way my f10 focal ratio is perfect without a Barlow. Which matters for me because I'm shooting with an alt-azimuth mount, a single arm alt-azimuth mount, and there's not a lot of room underneath the optical train of the telescope to clear the base of the mount. So keeping the imaging train short is important. And now, so the whole premise of modern planetary imaging. And I actually kind of hate the term lucky imaging because it kind of understates what's going on technologically and what the value of the technology is. As everybody here knows who does telescopes, the big challenge of terrestrial telescopy is disturbances in the atmosphere. And they're very hard to compensate for in conventional means. Big observatories can use adaptive optics where they're shining lasers up and using them as a reference light and dynamically warping their mirrors to adjust for that. But sometime in the 1960s or something, somebody said, well, the time scale of these atmospheric distortions is fairly small. And if we could take very short pictures, we could freeze them. Now, those atmospheric distortions are of a couple of different types. One is the object gets displaced uh, in space, it jiggles around, and the other is it gets distorted, it gets warped. Um, so the whole premise here is if you can take lots and lots of images, and they started this with film, trying to do it with film cameras, which didn't work very well because they're not very sensitive and it's an expensive operation. But then, along came CCD sensors and CMOS sensors, which were very efficient and could take very short exposures. And, again, this is not a technique that you would use for deep sky objects. Deep sky objects are very faint and they take very long exposures, but planets are really bright. So it's not a challenge at all to take 100 exposures per second, 200 exposures per second. And then what happens, and you can see it, this is a Wikipedia page, which I usually don't reference. And this is an illustration of lucky imaging for, again, which is a subset of something called speckle imaging. Here's a dramatization, if you will, and you can see arrayed across the top here are what exposures look like through the telescope over longer time spans. Really, basically what happens is we need a way to select the good pictures and analyze them and stack them together. This stacking techniques that's shown in the page here is not exactly what we use for Planetary. This is a kind of shift and offset method where you look through all the frames, you find out the ones that have the best quality, whether that's based on contrast detection or whatever, and then you shift them around and align them up and stack them together. And if you get a lot of them, you get better and better results the smaller percentage you pick. So 50% will give you worse results than 20%, which will give you worse results than 10%. Now, fortunately, we don't have to figure out anything. The software does it all, and I'll show that live. It works pretty easily. So we're gonna do imaging using lucky imaging, and then we're gonna process the images. And the main technique we're going to use to sharpen them, because they need, the details in the images need to be sharpened or deconvolved when we process them. And there's a long established technique for dividing up signals into their component frequencies. Obviously, I don't want to go in the weeds because I'll be wrong anyway, but when you do Fourier transforms, you can break a signal down into an infinite series of sine waves, which is great. It tells you what frequencies are in the signal, but it doesn't tell you anything about where they are temporally. So it turns out if you use little packets, little shape packets of sine waves and kind of shift them along the signal mathematically, you can find where they mesh, and you can get not just frequency information, but also temporal information. And it's wavelets. They've been around for really a long time. They're used all over the place. They're used in compression. They're used in image processing, and that's basically the main tool in our processing arsenal for planetary images is wavelet-based sharpening. Again, I've got links to all this stuff in here. The last page of this, which is coming up very shortly, is an accretion of links, and then we'll go into a live demo because I think that's much more compelling than slides. There are a number of different planetary capture applications. There are really two that are the leading candidates. There's fire capture, and there is SharpCap Pro, actually, if you're going to do planetary. And they both, fire capture is purely planetary capture. It was developed by a guy named Torsten Edelman in roughly 2008. Again, mainly because CCDs and the guys were doing imaging and webcams, and they really wanted better ways to capture that imaging. And SharpCap is a guy in England named Robin Glover, and he did that in 2010. And by the way, they're both free. So the basic SharpCap is free, but the interesting stuff for Planetary is part of the pro version, which again I think is a whole $18 a year. I use SharpCap, I would say, based on cloudy nights and the planetary images there. I'm guessing it's probably 80-20 fire capture SharpCap, maybe it's 70-30, but it's something like that. By the way, cloudy nights was my best source of information. There were a lot of misleading YouTube videos for guys that were not primarily planetary imagers, but managed to do some planetary imaging. They sent me down some wrong paths, and I will have a link to it on the cloudy nights. And I am sure most of you guys know the Cloudy Night forums. There's a planetary imaging forum, and they have a frequently asked questions section, which is great. It's kept up to date. It talks about everything we're going to talk about, and it's a great condensed way to find out all this stuff. The other thing is there are fewer guys who do planetary imaging than deep sky, clearly. And in fact, if you look at the Cloudy Nights forum, you would come away with the feeling that there are maybe 10 or 15 of them, which is maybe not that. I mean, it's a bigger community, but it's maybe that not that far from the truth. And I don't suffer from shyness, so when I started doing this, I messaged every one of those guys and said, "I'm doing this. What do you think? What should I do?" Every time they do a post, I would talk to them. And that actually worked out very well. And it led me in on some interesting paths of software testing and that kind of thing. So again, I'll show you this fire capture and SharpCap application live. And then the next thing we want to do is that much more complicated thing where we're going to analyze the images, select the best ones, and crucially figure out how to align them and add them together. And in case it's not intuitive, that's much easier with stars than it is with planets. When you're doing deep sky imaging, you have all these stars. You know stars are point sources. If they don't look like point sources, if you mathematically change the whole picture via a point spread function that makes them into a point source, then everything in that image will be stacked perfectly. You don't have that with planets. You have to detect features on the surface, whether it's planets or lunar or solar, and that's a much less trivial operation. Now, there was an all-in-one package that everybody used for years and years, and a lot of people still use now. I think Frank still uses as there's a package called Registax that was written by a guy named Cor Berowitz in Holland, and he wrote that originally in 2002. So that's the old school granddaddy, and that did stacking and wavelet sharpening and everything put together. And I'll return to Core later because he's a kind of key component of my presentation. But what emerged was in 2010, another guy from the Netherlands, a guy named Emil Kreikamp, wrote a stacking program that was purely stacking, alignment, stacking, analysis, etc. And that's called AutoStackert. And most people stopped stacking in Registax and went over to AutoStackert. And AutoStackert is actively developed. It's free. It's well maintained. They keep adding features, and I'll show you what AutoStackert looks like in a minute. So then, once we're stacked, we have the task of post-processing the stack, of doing the image sharpening and color corrections and all that kind of stuff. So as I mentioned, the real old school software for doing this was Registax. So I started using Registax as everybody else did, and I started running into some bugs. And of course, again, I'm not shy, so I emailed the guy who wrote Registax, and he said, "Well, uh, I haven't supported Registax for years. I have no means to support that code, and I'm coming out with something new called WaveSharp, and I think it's going to have all the best parts of Registax, and I'm going to give up the stacking. AutoStacker does that better than anything else." And I started playing with it, and I generated feedback. And he said, "Hey, you want to be a beta tester for Registax?" And I said, "Sure." So for the last year and 3 months or so, I've been very actively doing that. I have something like 260 test versions of WaveSharp on my across 3 different computers. It makes me feel less retired. In fact, sometimes it feels like a full-time job. But it's been kind of fun. There's 4 or 5 people who on that team, and I learn a lot from them. And Core Berovitz, very interesting guy. He's a retired bird researcher. He's super into bats. He and a friend built a bat detector kit, which I bought and built one of. He's a furniture maker. Cool guy. Anyway, uh,
Do you have any theory why all the software seems to find in Europe?
well, so as far as I know, I don't, other than the fact that all of these guys did it first for their own use. There wasn't something out there. They tended to be mostly academics. And I guess there was a culture that we just put this stuff out there. And if you want to use it, go for it. I'll talk about, in the end, I'll talk about a software application called WinJupos, which is an open source application that was based on the Jupos project. And this software was started by a guy named Grisha Han, also European, obviously, in 1992. And it's a collaborative platform that started collaboration to map the surface features of Jupiter, and it's gotten much bigger since then. So at any rate, these are some links that if you go around to the recording later, you might want to look at. They go into way more details on the physics of this stuff. And I used to once have an undergraduate degree in physics that I struggled through very badly. My math was really crappy, and it hasn't gotten any better. It's only gotten worse. So if I have to, I can talk to about some of that stuff, but I'll leave it to you. And I really do hope you guys will give it a try. By the way, all of the planetary images here are indeed mine. And almost all of them at the end of that driveway that you saw. Let me see if I can figure out a way to escape out of this presentation. So let's talk about let's do some live software. Let's see. Let's start with the acquisition. And let me just open a tab here. So I'm gonna launch the first piece of software I talked about called Fire Capture. And hopefully this will come through on the Zoom. I have hopes. And all these acquisition software will let you practice with a dummy camera. So if you have a camera connected, it'll find it. Otherwise, I'll tell it it's a dummy camera. And if there's any justice in the world, yeah, there is. And I don't want to use the dummy image that comes with it. I want to use one of my images, one of my recorded sequence. And one of the nice things about these is you can just drag and drop your captured video sequences into these, and it's just like you were looking at them in the first place. So I'll just open some Jupyter files. Now, when we record video for planetary imaging, we generally record in a format called the SER format. For you guys who do deep sky, you know that that a lot of people work in a FITS format, which is an astrophotography specific format. The SER format is the equivalent astrophotography format for video. Now, there's a picture of Jupiter. That looks pretty dancing and bobbing, right? This is really good seeing. This is excellent seeing, and we're going to work with it next. Now, so this is the application that I use to capture most of the time. It's called Fire Capture. Again, as I said, free. Um, some things that are important. When we're doing planetary capture, we generally just capture in 8 bits of resolution. There's no real benefit to capturing higher bit depths. Most of the lower significant bits, for those of you who are into that stuff, are just going to be noise anyway. And the files are much bigger, and we're making huge files in the first place.
Application. That's actually a short video, right?
This is a 3-minute video that I captured, yes. And in fact, as it goes, you'll see it. And here I can. It'll look a little better if I do that to it. But it looks pretty noisy, and it is pretty noisy. Now this, if you look where my cursor is, that was shot at a 400 by 400 pixel resolution. So my camera, the camera that I shot this with, is a 4K camera. Almost all of that is wasted. Planets are small. Jupiter at this point was probably about, I don't know, 43 arc seconds in diameter. And I'm shooting at something like 0.17, 0.18 arc seconds per pixel. So the whole planet is only 200 something pixels across. So if I don't have anything going interesting with moons and moon transits, I will come down to, and you know, those are referred to by everybody as regions of interest, ROIs. And I will crop down to that region of interest so that the file isn't carrying around all these black pixels that you're not going to do anything with. And you can get much faster transfer rates to the disk in the smaller files. Now, there's some controls here. Some of these are grayed out because because this is a captured file. But when you have your camera set up, the main parameters that you're going to play with on the camera are the gain of the camera and the exposure. Now, the exposure determines the frames per second. And so basically, if I want to shoot at 100 frames a second, the exposure is going to be 10 milliseconds because there are 100 of those in a second. I typically work with Jupiter at somewhere between 7 to 10 milliseconds. Mars, I'm working with smaller regions of interest. I'll show you some what Mars looks like in good seeing in a minute. And so I might go up to 250 frames a second. The limits on capture are interesting with Jupiter because Jupiter rotates very quickly with 9.9 hours and some odd minutes for a complete rotation. So at the image scales that I'm imaging at, and most of us would be, you can only image for about 3 minutes before the rotation is going to start to blur, start to become significant for your imaging scale. So I typically take 3-minute videos. Now I'm talking about one-shot color. There are guys in the club who image in RGB mono, and you got to divide by 3 for that. So Saturn will let you go longer. Most people will say about, most people will say about 5-ish to 7-ish minutes for Saturn. Mars, most people will say around 6-ish. By the way, you can divide your videos into shorter chunks if you want later, or you can put them together into longer chunks. There's software that does that. So basically, you're going to set the exposure to get to you the frames per second that you want. And then you're going to set the gain of the camera so that the histogram down here, and you can see separately the red, green, and blue signals, is somewhere in the 50 to 70% range, depending on what you're looking at. And I generally will adjust. You can adjust colors later. I generally try to keep the color balance on my camera pretty faithful. Jupiter's a good place to do that because Jupiter's got a lot of white. Yes, Frank.
They recommend no more than 80%.
Right, correct. Yeah.
narrowed, I usually dim it down to 50 to 60.
Yes, and especially with Mars, where you tend to saturate on the polar cap, you might want 60% as the absolute top. Jupiter, you can tolerate more. Sure. Yeah, and I'll show you that. I'll show you that in a minute. So at any rate, sharp cap fire capture is pretty handy. You can tell it what planet you're using, and it'll put the name of the planet. It'll put it in separate folders. It'll put the name of the planet and the file names. You'll see later that there's a software processing platform called WinJupos. Whether people are using WinJupos or not, WinJupos goes off of timestamps in the file names, and will usually set the capture software. All the capture software has an option to make WinJupos compatible file names, and it stamps the universal time in the file names. So basically, when I'm on a planet and I want to hit record, I just hit the record arrow. And for Jupiter, I can pre-configure it for 3 minutes. For each of the planets, you can pre-configure a number of minutes that you will tolerate. Now, another thing I really like about fire capture, and I like it better than all the other stuff out there. So I don't think most of us own mounts, or certainly not for our SCTs, that are going to track accurately enough to keep a 40 arc-second blob absolutely centered in the field of view. So, fire capture and sharp cap to some extent have tools that will electronically keep the planet centered. And I've got a little, actually, I guess I have to move that down here to see it. There's a little icon here where you can say center. And you notice as soon as I clicked that, it started to stabilize this image and put up these 4 little dots, which basically show where the thing is sitting on the sensor. See, when I take that off, it's going to wiggle a little more. No, I didn't take it off, so there he goes. Now, I don't use that much because there's something down here called center of gravity, where when you check that off and put an X wherever you want it, it will hold that center of gravity in the sensor. And by center of gravity, I mean, a lot of times I'll be doing Jupiter or Saturn with moons. And so I want to capture with Jupiter or Saturn, not in the center of the image, but offset to one side. So if I set that center of gravity function, it will maintain that offset. Now, obviously, when I say electronically stabilizing, it's not moving the image. It can't. It doesn't have any access to your optics. What it's doing is it's dynamically moving that region of interest to keep the planet accommodated. And if it drifts off the sensor, it can't do anything. I don't know about Frank, his mount may be more accurate than mine, but I find that I have to constantly make little adjustments to positions throughout the capture. I happen to use the hand controller because I find, at least with Celestron, that the computer interfaces are not as robust. Even computer interfaces to the USB port in the hand controller. I will mention, by the way, that I always use motorized focus. I have several motorized focusers. I started buying the ZWO ones, which are not that much money, but to me they seem pretty expensive. And then recently I've been starting to buy some cheap ones that are on AliExpress for like $60-something, and they work great, and they have infrared remotes. If you remind me, I'll go back in the presentation. I'll show you one hanging off the back. Probably the hardest thing to do throughout all of this is focus. You can't, a Bahtinov mask isn't going to help. You go to a star, focus it with a Bahtinov mask. It's not going to be precise enough for Planetary at the imaging scales we're working for. The focus is constantly changing. Between each 3-minute section, I will usually check focus. you know, and come back and forth through focus. What I'll usually do at the beginning of a capture, and I'll show you here, I'll show you an image with a moon. Here's Jupiter with a moon. Now this is, didn't want to do that. This is at a bigger region of interest because I've got a moon in there. Now the moon's a little hard to see up there. This, by the way, is the same night. This is 3 minutes before that larger image I just showed you. So this is identical conditions, identical seeing. There were light clouds drifting through. I should say that typically my best seeing is when there are some light clouds. Don't know why that is. Now, it's hard to see the moon. It's hard to see focus. One of the things that fire capture will let you do is adjust the contrast, the gamma and the brightness of the preview while you're capturing and while you're adjusting. So for instance, I'll tell it to enable screen adjustment, and then I'll slide that gamma around. You can see that moon becomes very easy to see. And what I will usually do, the other thing that's super critical for planetary imaging is collimation. The typical kind of collimation that you do for deep sky is not good enough. I wish it was. Collimation with a Tribatanoff mask isn't good enough. I wish it was. Generally, I'll check collimation at the beginning of every imaging session. Jupiter's good to do it with because it's got moons. And what I'll do is I'll take one of the moons and I'll center it in the region of interest, and I'll blow it up big. If the seeing is really stable, I'll look at its airy disk. If it's not, I'll come very slightly off of focus in both directions. And my collimation is always going to be good enough so that it's dead centered in the ring. But what you're looking for are flares of brightness to one side or the other that can really mess up your imaging. In fact, what I'll do here, let me just bring this down for a second. When I first borrowed this 9 1/4 telescope from Carl, I was very excited, and I set it up the first night, and the seeing was beautiful, and Jupiter had moon transits going on. So I did a quick check of collimation, but I didn't really tweak it. And here is somewhere here. Hold on. Here. Can't fool me. Tried to do this homework. Why is it not letting me? Okay. And here is a beautiful Jupiter transit. Let's see, where's that opening up? That's opening up here. And let me get this window out of the way. And there's Ganymede with surface detail, everything else, except you see those flares to the side? That's bad collimation. And you see how the features on the surface of the planet are smeared? That's bad collimation. Now, that collimation would be absolutely fine for deep space. I mean, that donut looks centered, everything. This is on a very small scale. So that's the one thing I wish wasn't the case. But I don't know if I've learned to love it, but I've learned to I've learned to put up with it. And
Focal length of the 9 1/2? Or that
it's an f10. It's a 9 1/4, so it's 2,350 millimeters, something like that. Yeah. But I shoot it with a 1.5 Barlow, so I'm bringing that up to f15.
and what camera are you using?
I use a CWO ASI 585 MC. If I were buying one now, I would probably buy a 678 or a 676. They have 2-micron pixels. So and in fact, I did just buy one. I don't need a Barlow. And for those of you with shorter focal ratio scopes, there's an ASI 715 that has 1.45 micron pixels. So that works out to about f7, 7.5. So that works with faster focal length. So let me find out where, oh, here we are. Let me bring that back. up again.
What's the designation of that camera with the 1 micron?
The 1.45 microns is the ASI 715 MC, I think. Yeah, I'll have to double check myself. I bought one of them too. By the way, when you want to set these regions of interest when you're capturing, all you have to do is drag your cursor around it, and it'll make a new region of interest. It's not going to do it for this one because it's a captured image at a fixed region of interest. So anyway, I will use this screen adjustment function a lot to make it easier for me to see focus. So I'll change the gamma so that and the brightness so that I'm increasing the contrast on the image. How are we doing on time? I'm running long. All right. And then
Here all night.
and for those of you who want to see what Mars looks like, hang on. Here's Mars on a night of pretty good seeing. This is captured at 250 frames a second. And, you know, Mars here is something like 12 arc seconds. It's pretty small. So this is a smaller region of interest yet. It's 300 by 300. By the way, there's a function in fire capture called a cutout, where you can set a cutout region around the planet. That'll actually make more sense if I bring Jupiter back. Hang on just a sec. And it'll close the region down to right alongside the planet. Let me go back to Jupiter here.
Bill, when you're setting up, do you have to? I honestly don't know.
Go ahead. No, it's an Altaz mount, and I do not polar align. If you have an equatorial mount, you're going to want to polar align. I just use Celestron. All those Altaz mounts have these alignment modes, and they all have a single object solar system alignment. So you don't have to go to reference stars. You don't have to do anything. You can see the planet. It's right there. You can't miss it. So you're not trying to do a go-to to some faint object that you're hunting around for. So hold on a second. Well, so I just do a single object solar system alignment, and it will track on that object all night. Now, again, this cutout function here on Jupiter, if I turn on the cutout function, it'll it'll put a tight box around it, and the box will track Jupiter. I'm not going to sit here and wrestle with it in front of you. These are really the sort of the key issues. So I'm going to kill fire capture, and I'm going to go to the other capture app that I use a lot, which is called SharpCap. Again, this is SharpCap Pro, and I mainly use this for outreach. It's got really good live planetary stacking. I do have a planetary stacking plugin in fire capture, but it's not as good. So what I do on SharpCap is I tell it what camera, and I'm going to say it's going to be a high-speed test camera, and there is that same Jupiter image that I had before. And you have all the same things. You have a region of interest, you have a histogram, you have gain, you have all that kind of stuff. There are two things in here. There's a planetary autofocus that sort of works. It'll get you close. I don't bother with it most of the time. But what it has that's really nice is live stacking. So if I go to live solar, lunar, and planetary stacking and get this menu out of the way, this is a very menu intensive application. That's live stacking. Okay, and I can change the sharpening factors. I can change the denoising. It's doing this now on the fly from that image as we're looking at it. So for outreach, that works great. I don't really need it when I'm capturing. I've done it enough to know what I'm getting. But you can't really beat that. And in fact, even I use SharpCap a lot for deep sky, and even with my when we were at Jones Beach last May, we had a golden moon come up. It was some kind of full moon name that I forget, Wolf or something like that. And I put my little 61 millimeter refractor on it. And this is what I got without any processing at all. So this is completely live stack. The color is the actual color of the moon. There's no post-processing here at all. This is just a snapshot from SharpCap's live stacking. So anyway, I recommend it for that. I'm going to move on now because we have at least some people in the audience who can't stay up late. And now let's stack something. So I'm going to load up that stacking application I talked about, AutoStacker. And in case you're sensing a theme here, I can just drag and drop the the captured file into AutoStacker. And here, let me do that. And let's stick with Jupiter. Yep.
It's like it's our HDI.
Oh, SER, SER. Because that has information in the header. SER has information in the header about what kind of camera you used, what its color space was, what the exposures were, all this kind of stuff. Now, as it happens, all these capture applications write a little file along the side that has all that stuff too. So if you can say, gee, what did I do here? I don't remember. It'll show you. So anyway, here's that same exact Jupiter SER. And in fact, I'll play it now. And there it is, just as wiggly as it was before. And if I scroll to the end, you can see that it's about 17,000, about 18,000 frames. So that is 3 minutes of Jupiter at 100 frames a second. Now, how the hell do you sort 18,000 frames? You can't. So you need software to do it. So the first thing I'll do, I can go over in depth the settings I use in AutoStacker, and if anyone wants to hang around later, I can. I've also got links in that presentation to a great YouTube video by the author of AutoStacker, recent one, where he goes through it. I really learned a lot for it, because this is one of the areas that YouTube videos gave me the worst advice. So first of all, in order to stack, we don't have a star as a reference point. So what you have to do is you have to identify features on the surface of the planet that you want it to align to. Now, you do not have to do that manually. AutoStacker has a function for doing that. It says place AP grid, and there's a couple of options here. There's the option to multi-scale, which you want. So it's going to put multi-scale reference points on that. And what you want to do is you want to pick a size. There's a size setting here that's going to give you roughly 30-ish alignment points per frame. Like I have 49 there. Let me replace it. And that gives me 36 alignment points. That's about perfect. More you're wasting them, and you typically are going to lead to artifacts in the stack. This I got from Emil's YouTube video, which was, I didn't know. And by the way, all these applications, this application works on a batch process. So I'll have a whole night's worth of captures. I'll throw them all in here, set these alignment points, and as long as my region of interest was the same, it'll line them all up. A lot of people used to use, and some still use, a software called PIP, Planetary Imaging Preprocessor. The recent versions of AutoStacker generally have features that make that not important. There's an advanced feature here that says detect abrupt horizontal or vertical artifacts planted on edge of field of view. That used to be something you need PIP for. so anyway, the first thing you'll do is you'll hit a button that says Analyze, and it's going to run through those 18,000 frames, and it's going to put up a graph for you. And it's doing a general quality estimate based on contrast. Frank.
Website, you see local and,
Yep.
to go down.
Yeah.
Do you click on local?
Absolutely local. If you're doing lunar or solar, it's global. Absolutely local. And I'm sorry, again, I didn't want to drag everybody. So I tell it it's a planet. I want to do local quality estimation. I want it to look at those alignment points and estimate the quality based on them. I tell it to normalize the brightness, normalize the histogram to 70%. I tell it to align RGB, because if my RGB alignment wasn't perfect from my atmospheric dispersion corrector, this will help fix it. I tell it to save in folders. And then up here, you can tell it what percentage of frames you want to stack. And generally, you're using this graph here to figure that out. So these little lines are the quality of the frames in order, that bar graph. And they're all over the place. I had clouds moving through, so you can see they go way down. If you get very consistent seeing, you'll see them much flatter. And then this green line here is showing where it crosses the 50% point. Anything above that, 50% of your images are better and 50% are worse. So sometimes your 50% point will be over here, and you'll know that you have to reduce the size of your stack. So generally, I set the stack somewhere before this green line crosses that middle point. And up here, you can tell it what percentage of frames you want to stack. And usually I'll do several. I'll do 10%, 20%, and 40%, say. I'm just going to do 20% here. Now, by the way, if you have bigger images, this takes longer. Oh, and I do want to say, well, I'll show you what we do if there's moons in the image in a minute, because they're harder to see.
Is that the whole graph? So that's separated into quartiles?
Yeah. Yep. It just helps you estimate. So I'm going to do a 20% stack on this right now live. So I'm going to tell it to stack. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to look through all of those alignment points, and it's doing contrast detection. It's doing basically, it's recognizing the patterns in each of those little alignment points. It's generating a single reference image that it's going to use. However, for each of those alignment points, it's going to go, now, by the way, it's done. For each of those alignment points, it's going to separately evaluate the frames in the stack, and it's going to actually shift them and warp them to line up with each other. It's got some very sophisticated math under the hood. So we have just made a 20% stack from that. And if I go to, it made a folder, and this is what the stack looks. It's not sharp. It still needs to be sharpened. Let's see, I don't know what I have that opens TIFF, probably GIMP. So it's going to launch GIMP here, but this is what the GIMP launches slow. This is, that was not it. This is what that stack looks like right out of AutoStacker. So this is before sharpening or deconvolution. This is what that stack, we just made this stack. I haven't faked anything here. So now, if I did have a planet with moons, they're hard to see. And so what we can do, I'll clear those alignment points. We can raise the brightness in the preview window. And then, in addition to the automatic alignment points in the planet, so if I were doing this for real right now, which I'm not going to bother, I would have it place the automatic grid, and it's going to miss the moon because it's below the brightness threshold. So what I would do is I would crank up the brightness, and I would take a manual alignment point and stick it on the moon and then bring the brightness back down. So for any moons in the scene, that lets AutoStacker know that you wanted to align on those as well. All right, so I'm done with AutoStacker unless there are questions later. So the next thing we need to do is we need to process and sharpen that image. So let's, again, most people use Registacks. As I said, I got a hold of the guy who writes it. He said, I'm doing a new thing. Why don't you use that? And that's what I've been doing. That's called WaveSharp. The version 2 is still in beta, but it's publicly out. I'm going to launch WaveSharp version 2. I do get a credit on the splash screen. And so let's open that image that we just stacked. Give me 1 second. That was in here in ASP20, and I'm going to open that up in WaveSharp. Now I'm going to do two things in pre-processing. I know my telescope, as do most of ours, inverts the image, and I also know that I usually shoot with my camera upside down. So I have to tell it to flip both the X and Y axis to make it in a north-up orientation, which is what I usually use. There are a lot of settings here, but the main things that I care about are what color model I'm using, whether when I sharpen, whether I'm sharpening just the luminance channel or whether I'm sharpening the color channels as well. I almost always sharpen the color channels too, unless it's very noisy color, or Mars tends to be small and have a lot of color. And sometimes if I convolve in RGB space, I pick up artifacts. But I'm gonna do this in RGB space. The modern color space that most people use is called OK Lab. That's been around for about 3-ish years, I think. There are other models in here for legacy. So these are the wavelet sliders. So basically what we're doing with wavelets is we're taking that image and we're, to oversimplify a lot, we're dividing it into frequency bands: low frequency, middle frequency, and high frequency. And we can independently tweak those frequency bands. So most of the information is in the high frequency. And I'm going to crank this number up a little and move this slider. And you can see that image is very significantly sharpening. So again, here I'll turn off that filter and I'll turn it back on. And if we want to see what's going on, I'll zoom in there. Okay, again, filter off, filter on. Now that's the high frequency values. I'll sharpen up some middle frequencies here, and you can see that's mainly going to affect the coarser parts of the image. And I'll sharpen up some low frequencies here, and you have a choice of different filters, that kind of thing. The other thing I want to mess around with is the colors. So I can look at that color histogram. Actually, before I look at the colors, I'm going to do something else. I want to denoise it, because when you sharpen, you introduce noise. One thing that's really novel in WaveSharp, he's got a new denoising technique that's been practical for about a year, which is based on doing Fourier transforms on the image, looking at its frequency spectrum. So this graph is called the power curve. It shows this is the low frequency content. These are the contributions of high frequency content. And if you look, you can see in the capture, there's a little dip here and then it plateaus out. And I can slide a cutoff to that point. And if I slide a cutoff to that point and roll off the frequencies beyond that, I'm just getting rid of noise and I'm not losing any detail on the images. And it makes it much easier to see what's going on. Now, if I could, as it happens, this is not a very noisy image. I'll crank the noise up a little and I'll turn off the denoising. And if you look at that zoom, you can see that it's really speckled. And if I turn that denoising back on, and let me then restore the sharpening to something normal, those speckles are alleviated. And again, here what I'll do is if I can get it to pop up on the screen, I'll turn denoising off, and you see speckles crop up, and I'll turn it on, and you'll see the speckles go away without trading off any detail. And then usually the other thing I'll do is I'll adjust color. And so here's the histogram that we captured at. Now you want to do a couple of different things. You want a white balance, because my white balance wasn't perfect when I captured. And if you look at the colors in this histogram, you can see my red isn't up to my green and blue, and I know there are a lot of whites. Now, there are a lot of ways that you can do a white balance. You can have it computed from the full image or the region of interest. Usually what I do, if I know that something is white on a planet, I'll put up this little blue box, and I'll shrink its size, and I'll move it around, and I will plunk it down on a piece of the planet that's white. And I'll turn it off, and if you look at our histogram, voila, they are white balanced. And then usually what I'll do is I'll stretch the histogram a little to brighten it up. I'll take the end of the histogram and pull it out that way. And then I'll probably play with the contrast a little. Sometimes I'll crank up the saturation. Now, that's the basic function of WaveSharp. However, what I really, really, really like about WaveSharp, because there are other sharpening softwares that are good. There's something called AstroSurface that Frank uses a lot. I use from time to time. But what WaveSharp lets you do is put a big batch of images in, and treat them all, and then you can go through the batch and see what you got that was good and what you got that was bad. And very importantly, it'll make animations out of them. So I'm going to open a batch. This is from that same capture session. The same parameters, but I stacked more. So I'm going to open up a batch. And I'll go to my batch tab, and I'm going to click through them and see how they look. Now, you see the planet was rotating during these captures. You can also see that I'm getting field rotation. And I'm getting field rotation because I'm using an alt-azimuth mount here. Okay, so again, I'll try to pick some sharpening parameters that make sense for, averaged across most of the images. But there's a new feature in WaveSharp that I'm pretty confident that nobody here has messed with much, which is derotation in the batch alignment. So I'll pick one of these images that I want to use as a reference, and I'll click this button that says Set Reference. And now, when I click through the other images in the batch, they're derotated. Now, those of you who don't image without azimuth mounts have no idea how cool that is, because that was an incredibly hard process, taking hours and hours before, and it's a single click now. And I can say balance the brightness across the images in the batch. They don't all have to have the same region of interest. It'll figure that out. It's really cool. Now let's make an animation. You would think, boy, that's going to take a long time. It'll take about 5 seconds. So down here, you see there's a thing that says Create Animation. And you have your choice of doing a GIF animation or a series of PNGs, APNGs. So I'm going to do a GIF animation. I'm going to say I want to go 15 frames a second. I want it to pause for 3 frames at the end, and I want it to do a reverse at the end of the animation. And I'm going to just click a button here. So I know you haven't seen this. So I have now made that animation. So if I go to my folder there, and good to meet you guys, Ron. Take it easy. Oh, all right, great. And I'm sorry, let me go back to my Jupyter files and stacked, and I put that animation in something called process batches, and there it is, and let's open it up. So we just made that. That was the whole process of making that animation. So you say, boy, this guy Bill puts animations up on the web page all the time. I make an animation every time I image because it's this easy. And that, as far as I know, is unique to this software. Now, let's process something else. I'll show you a couple of other unique features.
The combinations, how many 3-minute things did it take to make that?
Each one of those in the stack was 3 minutes, and I think there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, okay. Oh, all right. And you know, and so depending on how many I have, I'll make them more or less, you know. So there's probably a little pause between these 3-minute sections, but it's roughly 12 times 3 minutes worth of capture. If I'm having moon transits or shadow transits or that kind of thing, I will do much longer captures because I want to catch the whole transit. I'll show you some transits in a bit. So talking about moons, there are a lot of other manual processing things that people do with planetary images. And one of the problems is, especially when you're imaging things like Saturn, is that the moons are very dim. And typically what most people will do is actually separately process the moons from the image as layers and then go in Photoshop or thanks for coming. Or some kind of similar software and combine them in layers and adjust their brightnesses. That's a huge pain in the neck. I'm incredibly lazy. So what another feature that went in here, let's bring a Saturn into here. This is Saturn from hold on. This is Saturn from this year. You can see the rings are not that great and are not that big. And by the way, when I white balance on Saturn, it's generally accepted that the rings are pretty much gray. So I'll turn on my white balance button and I'll put the little blue thing on the rings and it'll make them gray, and hopefully that makes the colors on the planet reasonably accurate. Now, I started a thread on Cloudy Nights about what color Saturn is. That only went to 3 pages. There's another page about planetary coloring that went to 22 pages. Suffice it to say that it's controversial. Planetary imagers, by the way, usually take great pains, unless they're, you know, going through a particular filter to emphasize images, to try to get stuff accurate on the surface. We're not making up colors. We're not making up features that aren't there. There are some people who process with topaz denoise. It's a big controversial thing. There's no doubt that it sometimes infers features that aren't really there. I don't use it. So I happen to know that Saturn here has a bunch of moons. I can't see them. Now, I could crank up the gamma on that image significantly, but then I'm cranking up the gamma on Saturn. So what I can do is I can look at a background layer here, and lo and behold, there are 3 moons. Okay, so what I would ideally like is a function that lets me differentially brighten those moons without brightening Saturn. And coincidentally, WaveSharp has such a function. So that's called the background enhancement function. And I'm going to make it active. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this first parameter and I'm going to adjust it up. And again, this is all in the documentation. I don't want to beat it to death. I'm going to adjust it up till those moons are just covered up by this automatic mask. Okay, and then I'm gonna degrade them. I'm gonna, you know, till they're just kind of showing, and then I'm gonna erode the extra stuff that's not moons, and then I'm going to make that active, and lo and behold, there are the moons. And I can separately change their gamma. I can change their brightness. I can change the smoothing function, and these are legitimately the moons. I'm not inventing anything here. These are really there.
Data just.
They're in the data. Yeah, it's just they're dim compared to Saturn. So that's a novel feature. And by the way, this works great for animation. So if I have a night of Saturn, I'll do exactly what I did before. I'll derotate those animations and I'll bring out the moons, and then I'll have a night of Saturn with dancing moons. I think I posted a couple of those. Now, there's another thing that happens. And this is something happens to all planets. It's particularly prominent in Mars. And that's a phenomenon called the edge rind. There are a lot of things that contribute to edge rind. Now, I'm going to show you what edge rind looks like right now.
It's the second word, edge.
Rind, R-I-N-D. And Ken, there's a link in here to an article on Mars edge rind, which goes into multiple pages of why Mars has a particularly significant rind. But here, let me open Mars here. Hold on. So here's Mars, and Mars is pretty small, so I'm going to make it big for you. And when I crank up the sharpening on Mars, let me just do a little bit of a white balance. I also happen to know that that polar cap up there is white, so if I make this really small and click on the polar cap, that's a pretty good color balance for Mars. And the more I sharpen it, and the more I bring up the imaging layers, I make it a little bigger so it's easier to see. You can see on this side, we're getting an artifact. That's a Mars edge rind. There are several reasons for that. Generally, anytime we're digitally reconstituting a signal from its frequency components, when there's a sharp step, we get ringing at the edges of the sharp step. That's called the Gibbs phenomenon, or a Gibbs artifact. I do have in here, coincidentally, a Wikipedia. No, sorry, I didn't want Jupiter files on.
So is that due to refraction of light?
Well, it's due to two different. No, so the Gibbs effect is not refraction. Gibbs effect is an artifact. It is in part, but a Gibbs effect is an artifact that happens at the edge of a discontinuous signal that's gone through Fourier transforms. So let's see, somewhere in here, here's a Gibbs effect. Come on, Bill. So you see here, you see the little horns at the edge of a square wave, and it depends on how many approximations you use in the Fourier series. Basically, the rule is they're always the same amplitude, but they get thinner. But you can't represent a square wave without those artifacts at the edge of those peaks. It's just a consequence. You don't have an infinite series to recombine. You have to pick a certain number, and that's what you get. But Matt, to your point, there are also diffraction artifacts, typically on the bright limb of Mars. There are things that make them worse. If your collimation is worse, it'll typically make it worse. Now, by the way, this is absolutely a phenomenon in medical imaging as well. When you sharpen images, I have links here. There's articles on MRI imaging and everything else. This is a problem. When you get a sharp transition, you'll get ringing on the edge. Now, in Mars, it's made worse. It's usually worse if the bright limb of the planet is next to an area of dark albedo, as it is here. And you got a lot of red there. There's a lot of diffraction in the red. And you'll notice that it's a twofold artifact. You get a white edge and then a dark ripple. So what could you do? You could bring it in Photoshop and you could airbrush it. Absolutely. And most people do that, make a couple of layers, airbrush it out. But I want to invent anything. Well, I don't care, but the core who wrote this doesn't want to invent anything. And well, if it's a sharpening artifact, what if we could pick an area where we could smoothly disable the sharpening? So I happen to have such a thing. This is a de-rind function. And I will make it active for a moment and show it. And there's a mask around the planet. Now that rind didn't go all the way around the planet. It just kind of occupied an arc here. So what I want to do is I want to make a gap in that arc. Make a pretty big gap. Because I mainly want to cover, where's my cursor? This area right here. Because I've got a region here that I don't want to mess up. I don't know whether that's clouds or polar. I don't want to mess up the ice cap. So what I'll do is I'll make that short segment and make the gap a little bigger. Why not? I'll make that short segment. I'll line it up with that edge and I'll say, let's feather it out and smooth it a bit. And now, if there's any justice in the world, there's without and there is with. Now I can fool around with the feathering, I can fool around with the settings, but what I really like is we're not making anything up, we're not hand brushing anything, we're just suppressing the sharpening in that rind region. And we get rind with Jupiter too, by the way. We get rind with Saturn. And in fact, this has a special function with Saturn because the rind is on the planetary orb, not on the rings. And if you click Saturn, it'll make two gaps. And then you adjust them so where the rings are, and it'll just de-rind the rest of the planet.
We'll have a show of the glint.
Nice. Absolutely. And you have lots of diffraction with the red. You have a rapid, I mean.
So, to the astronomer, Martin Wallace,
Yeah, sure.
he paper about this, how to get rid of the gifford pads.
I think I have a link to that paper here, Frank. Yeah, I think maybe I gave it to you. I don't remember. But but I do have it here. Okay. At any rate, I like this technique a lot because I'm not making anything up, and it works for animations. So if I derotate first and then do the rind suppression, it goes through the whole animation. So you have now seen from soup to nuts the bulk of my planetary image processing. If you hang around for a couple more minutes, I'll show you one more thing. I mentioned this early on. There is in the early 90s, there was a collaborative program to map the surface features of Jupiter from contributions from astronomers all over the world, amateur and otherwise. It was called the JUPOS project. For some reason, their website is insecure now. I can't get to it. I would have put up, but I have some relevant links. Now, there's a few things that I do with WinJupos. One thing I do all the time is if I want to know what the hell is interesting happening with Jupiter tonight, for instance, or Mars or Saturn or anything else, I'll call up the ephemerides. I first have to tell it which celestial body I want. And so here's Jupiter. Here's Jupiter right now. This is what Jupiter looks like right now. I can zoom in and out to see if there are any moons around. There's Europa. I can scroll through time to see what they're doing. There's Europa and Io, and I can see at whatever time this is, we're going to have either, I don't know whether that's an occultation or a transit, I won't know for a minute, occultation. And so I use this all the time. I can see what the angular size of the planet was. I can see its altitude. Now, I didn't have to put any dates or times in because I created those files with the WinJupos compatible file name. I have to put in the focal length of my telescope. I have to put it, well, I actually don't have to for this function. I have to for another function that I'll talk about. I have to tell it whether I'm using an equatorial or an alt-azimuth mount. But hold on, let me just zoom that back in because it's going to drive me crazy. So that's what's going on in Jupiter. So I can see when the red spot's out, I can see any moon transits, occultations. There's other software that does it. But WinJupos just works great. And you can see Mars, Saturn, etc. And oh, by the way, I didn't mention when we're doing stacking and auto stackered, it also does impact detection and that kind of stuff. So it's a lot of amateur astronomers will contribute to detecting object impacts on the surfaces of planets, and auto stackered will detect it and you can report it electronically.
Can this Jupiter be used by non planetary photographers? In other words,
No,
you have to.
no, it's planetary. Planetary, period. It's got all the planets.
If I wanted to see what Jupiter was doing,
Yes. Oh, no. This is not looking, in this case, actually, I wasn't looking at a file. I'm just saying real time, right now, this is what Jupiter is doing. WinJupos. It's a free download. Again, everything here was free except for SharpCap Pro with the sharpening. Now, what most, like the guys who are making wall hanger planetary images, you know, Damian Peach, Crisco, these guys. So the more images you have to contribute to the stack, the better your signal to noise ratio is. That's why we're going for a lot of images. Besides the fact that we're freezing the seeing, those images are noisy, but the noise is random and the features aren't. So when you stack them, the noise cancels out and the features reinforce each other. So you get a certain signal to noise ratio. But so with Jupiter, for instance, I can get 3 minutes worth of that. But what if I want 10 minutes or 15 minutes? I'm going to get better signal to noise ratio if I can average the surface features, but I don't want them to smear. So pretty much all of those serious planetary imaging guys use WinJupos for image derotation. And I'll show you briefly how that works. I will say, I want to do image measurement. And there is that, coincidentally, that stack of Jupiter we've been playing with. And in this case, it did use the file name to figure out where it was. And I did tell it my focal length and the fact that it's an equatorial mount. And you can see that it's putting up a wire frame around Jupiter. Now, I can manipulate that wire frame. I can, if I click on that, I guess, I can, oh, I've got to go into measurement tab, sorry. I can rotate it around, I can scale it up and down, I can, I can move it, that kind of thing. However, there's an automatic function that usually works pretty well, and I'll just hit F11 and it will match that to the planet. Now, it knows that the limbs got darkened a little in processing. And ideally, what I'll use is partially sharpened images with this. So I can put limb diameter compensation in and get a more accurate adjustment of the wireframe. So what I will do sometimes, because I don't use it all the time, is I'll take 4 or 5 of those 3-minute images. I'll do this measurement on them. It saves the measurement files. And then you go into a screen called derotation of images. And by the way, this RGB imagers use this all the time because this will also align up their separate RGB images. But I'm going to say derotation of images. And there are these are 4 image files in that sequence because I figured about a 12-minute. Well, it's a little more than 12 minutes because there are gaps between them. But that you know, that's going to give me better signal to noise ratio. And it'll look up all those wireframe files. And sometimes you have to manually line them. You know, it's not always this automated. And then all I have to do is tell it to compile an image sequence. Now it's going to ask me, do I want to overwrite the one it did? And I'm going to say no, because I happen to have the one it did. And there is a little thumbnail of a derotated Jupiter. Now it's, again, I use partially sharpened so that I could go back and mess with the sharpening later. And if I open Wave Sharp, let's just do that again. Now that's already turned around, so I'm going to tell, when we open it, I'm going to tell WaveSharp I don't want it to flip them. Sorry. And I'll say stacked and process batches, and I made a folder called WinJupos. There's the derotated one. So those are the images that contributed to it. There's the derotated one. Maybe I lied and there are 4. And I'm going to tell it not to flip it over because it doesn't need to be flipped over. And I don't have to derotate anything because WinJupos did that. And if I blow it up, and again, this has, so I had pretty much all the noise pulled out before I put the images in. So I typically don't have to denoise, and I have to sharpen very lightly, much less than I did. And, you know, you'd have to bring up the other image to compare, but the signal to noise ratio is better in this image. So if I were going to do a wall hanger, I would probably go through this pane. If I'm just making animations and stuff, I would skip it. So you have now come to the end of my pre-planned presentation, a little longer than I was expecting it to go.
WinJupos, am I correct, assuming that the center of the planet gets enhanced a little bit more than the east?
Of course, because you don't have information at the edges, and if you do a longer sequence, it'll be worse. It doesn't, it tries to compensate for moon transits and shadow transits, but it's not very good at that. You often get artifacts. So it's not a panacea. Also, I found that when I was imaging with my 6-inch, when I started, it had very little extra. My detail wasn't fine enough to really benefit from WinJupos. Thanks for coming by, guys. And really only recently have I started to revisit it and say, oh, look, I'm getting some gains here. Are they dramatic gains? They're not dramatic gains, but I can say, if you're a pixel peeper, you can see them. So again, that was my spiel. If anyone wants to play with anything, I'm here. And anyone have any questions, I'll take them.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Was there a project?
Let me see if I can.